I took the long road on purpose. There were faster routes I could have taken, but I didn't. Sometimes, when I'm driving alone and the air in the truck feels too clean, too quiet, I find myself wanting to stir up old feelings just to remind myself I'm still here. So, I took Highway 66 out of Sault Ste. Marie and kept going until I hit the dirt roads near Foster Lake. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that made everything look like it was dipped in ash. It had been 8 years since I'd seen the cabin. Her cabin, not mine. She got it in the divorce. Small victory in a sea of things that didn't matter anymore. We weren't married long, just under 5 years. Her name was Claire. I was 42 now. She'd be 38 if she were still alive. Car crash outside Marquette last winter. Black ice. No foul play. Just bad luck and a slippery bend in the road. We hadn't talked in years. Not out of hate, just time. Time eats up everything eventually. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't even call her parents. It felt like we both lived separate lives by then. What would I have said anyway? The cabin sat about 40 minutes off the main highway, tucked in behind a patch of thick trees. It wasn't big, maybe 600 square feet total. No running water, propane for heat, outhouse 50 feet back. She used it mostly in the summers. When we were still together, we'd come out there with a cooler full of beer and forget about cell phones and bills and the weight of everyday crap that hangs on you. I remember chopping wood shirtless while she made grilled cheese on the camp stove. That sort of memory stings a little, but it's dull now, like pressing on an old bruise. Anyway, I was heading south toward Grand Rapids for work. I fix ATVs and snowmobiles for a living. A guy in Barry County had a Polaris that needed a full transmission rebuild, and he was willing to pay out the nose if I picked it up that day. I figured it wouldn't hurt to swing by the old gravel roads one more time, see what was left, maybe park for 10 minutes. That was the plan. As soon as I turned off the main road and onto the dirt, the trees swallowed everything.
No shoulder.
No signs, just 2 ruts carved into damp gravel. There were deep puddles from last night's rain. My truck's tires kicked up little beads of mud as I eased forward. It was late afternoon but looked closer to dusk with how the trees crowded the light. I passed the rusted fence post where the old mailbox used to hang. Nothing there now but bent metal and vines. The turnoff to the cabin came up on the right. I hadn't told myself I'd go in. I just wanted to look, but I turned. It hadn't changed much. The weeds were taller, maybe. The grass had taken over the path. Her red canoe was still flipped over by the fire pit. A blue tarp flapped loose on the roof, ripped and weather-bleached. I rolled to a stop beside the old stump where we used to leave our cooler. My truck's engine ticked as it cooled. The silence settled like fog.
No birds.
No wind, not even bugs. I got out. The first step I took toward the cabin felt heavy. Not like dread. More like my body remembered something my head didn't. The air had that deep wood smell. Wet moss, damp pine, old rot. Familiar but not warm. Like walking into a childhood home that got turned into a rental. The front door was closed. Windows intact. The screen on the porch had a big rip in it, but that was probably always there. I tried the knob. Locked. I walked around back. The outhouse was leaning, the door half open. The old axe was still buried in the stump out there. Handle faded to gray. The shed was wide open, tools scattered inside. Her green kayak paddle was snapped in half and shoved through the chain link fence like a spear. That felt off. I walked up to the back door and checked the knob. It opened. Inside, everything smelled like old paper and mouse piss. The couch had mildew on it. The coffee table was covered in dry pine needles. There were footprints, small ones, in the dirt across the floor. Not fresh. Could have been Claire's. Could have been anyone's. A raccoon, maybe. I told myself that, but the pattern looked like a person walked in barefoot, stood in the middle of the room, then turned around. I stood there for a long time, not moving. just breathing shallow and listening. Still no sounds. I walked slowly through the place. Bedroom still had her blue sleeping bag on the cot. Flashlight on the nightstand, rusted from battery rot. Her hunting boots tucked under the bed. She wore a size 6. I remember because she always needed special inserts. She left a half-burned candle in the window. The wax had melted down the frame and hardened in thick yellow globs. In the corner, the closet door was open. I stared at it for a long time. There were 2 things in there. A red duffel bag I didn't recognize and a piece of notebook paper stuck to the back wall with duct tape. I pulled the bag out. It was full of canned food, an empty water jug, and a flashlight with dead batteries. The food wasn't expired. Some of it was dated from 6 months ago. That was strange. She'd been dead almost a year. I looked at the note. It had one line written in messy black marker. Don't trust the man outside. No name.
No explanation.
I stood there for a long time. I hadn't seen a single person on the road in. No cars, no tire tracks, no footprints outside. But that note, that shook something deep in me. Something I didn't want to admit. Felt like someone had been here after her. Someone maybe still came here. I folded the note and put it in my jacket pocket. I didn't want to stay any longer. I grabbed the duffel and backed out of the bedroom. As I turned, I knocked over an old lantern. It hit the ground with a loud bang and rolled. That sound echoed, and then I heard something outside. A crunch. Not loud, just a soft crack of branches. My mouth went dry. I hadn't locked the front door behind me. My truck was still parked out front. I moved to the window beside the couch and peeled back the curtain. There was a man standing at the edge of the tree line, far enough that I couldn't see his face, close enough that he could see mine. He didn't move. He wore a dark jacket.
Tan pants.
Looked like some kind of parka. I thought maybe it was a hunter, but he wasn't holding a gun, just standing there, arms hanging at his sides. I stepped back from the window. My heart was pounding now. My breath felt thick. That note burned in my pocket like it was radioactive. I crossed the floor, fast but quiet, shut the back door and locked it, turned off the small battery-powered lantern on the wall. The cabin dropped into gray shadow. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I checked the window again. He was gone. I stepped out onto the back porch slowly.
No noise. No voices.
I looked around the yard. Empty. I kept my eyes on the trees and jogged around the side of the cabin toward my truck. I got in and locked the doors. When I started the engine, my headlights swept across the front yard. There was something lying on the fire pit. I put the truck in reverse, backed up just enough to aim the lights straight at it. It was a dead rabbit. Fresh, neck snapped clean. It wasn't there when I first arrived. I left. I didn't care about the mud. I drove too fast, grinding through ruts, splashing through puddles. I didn't check my mirrors until I was 5 miles back up the road. When I did, I thought I saw someone standing where the road bent out of sight. Just a figure. Might have been nothing. I didn't stop again until I reached the Shell station outside of Senni. I pulled into the lot, shut off the truck, and just sat there. My hands were shaking. I pulled out the note again, stared at the handwriting. Big, sharp letters. Not Claire's. I took a picture of it with my phone, folded it back into my jacket. I thought about calling someone, police maybe, but what would I say? That I trespassed on a dead woman's cabin and saw a man in the woods? They'd shrug and say it was a hiker, maybe a local, maybe someone camping. No crime in standing in the trees. But that bag, the food, the note, the dead rabbit, that was deliberate. I went home and didn't tell anyone. Weeks passed, but it stayed with me. I stopped sleeping through the night, started keeping my pistol close, checked my security cams every morning like a routine. I told myself I was overreacting. Then, 3 weeks later, I found a photo in my mailbox.
No envelope.
It was a picture of the cabin, taken from the woods, angle from the back, same direction I'd entered from. There was no return address, no writing, just that photo. I moved 2 months later, left the Upper Peninsula. I still do repair work, but mostly south now. Indiana, Ohio, sometimes Illinois. I never went back to the cabin. I burned the photo. I still have the note though, folded up, tucked in a drawer with my old registration papers. Sometimes I pull it out when I need to remind myself. Some people die and leave behind more than just memories. Some places remember, and some men never leave the woods, even after you think they should. I didn't set out to stay in that cabin. It just happened that way. At the time, I was 34, living in Spokane, Washington, working from home, and going through what most people would call a rough patch. I'd lost my father to a sudden heart attack just 2 months before. I'd also gone through a bad breakup earlier that year. I needed space. I needed silence, nature, maybe some time to figure out where I was going and what I was doing with my life. I packed up my Ford Escape one Thursday morning in mid-September 2022 with a tent, sleeping bag, hiking boots, and some basic supplies, canned food, a camp stove, a small hatchet, a water filter, and a handgun I kept mostly for peace of mind. My plan was to head into the forests of northern Idaho, not too far from Priest Lake, and spend 5 or 6 days completely off the grid. No signal, no internet, just me, trees, and time. I parked my car off a dirt road about 2.5 hours from the nearest gas station, hiked about 4 miles in, and pitched my tent in a small clearing beside a narrow creek. It wasn't on any trail map I had, but the area looked undisturbed and dry. I stayed there for 2 nights. The weather was cold, and the mosquitoes were relentless, but the silence helped. The first 2 days passed slowly, just how I wanted. I spent the time hiking small ridges, boiling creek water for coffee, and writing in a leather-bound notebook I hadn't touched in years. It was on the 3rd morning when I noticed the map I'd brought didn't fully match what I was seeing in the woods. The tree density in one part of the ridge to the west seemed lighter than what the topographic lines indicated. That wouldn't usually mean much, but the ground looked unnaturally level too, as if something had been there at some point and cleared. My curiosity got the best of me, so I decided to check it out. I packed a day's worth of food and water, stuffed my flashlight and a second magazine for the pistol into my bag, and headed west. I was about a half mile into the ridge when I found it. The roof was the first thing I saw through the trees, a collapsed triangle of rusted tin sheets barely visible beneath decades of pine needles and moss. I pushed through a thick patch of underbrush and found myself standing in front of what used to be a cabin. It had to be 60 or 70 years old. The wooden walls had gone gray with age. One side had fully caved in, leaving splintered boards reaching up like broken ribs. The other half was mostly intact, though the windows were shattered and the door hung off its frame. There was no road, no trail, no signs of recent visitors. I walked around it slowly, carefully. There were thick chains on the rear door, rusted shut. An old rain barrel lay on its side near the back, with moss growing in thick layers on its rim. Oddly, there was a pair of boots half buried under a bush near the corner of the building. Real old, leather ones, cracked and green with mildew. They didn't look modern at all. I stood there for a long time, looking at the place, half wondering what happened and why it had been left to rot. The smart thing would have been to head back to camp, but I didn't. The weather had been turning colder at night, and the cabin looked like it could offer real shelter, better than a tent at least. I told myself I'd stay just 1 night. I'd clear out the trash, set up a fire outside, and sleep inside with the pistol next to me. Just 1 night. I went back to my tent, packed everything up, and made the slow hike back to the cabin before dusk. I spent the next 2 hours clearing out the main room, kicking away loose boards, and sweeping out piles of dead pine needles and mouse droppings with a branch. I was careful not to disturb too much. I didn't open any drawers or cabinets, just moved what I needed to make a space for my sleeping bag in the corner furthest from the broken wall. That first night was colder than the last 2 had been. I lit a small fire just outside the open door and sat there for hours with a metal cup of reheated soup in my hands. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. I didn't hear any owls or coyotes, just the soft whisper of wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin walls behind me. I should have felt uneasy, but I didn't. Not yet. The problems started the next morning. I woke up with my heart pounding. Not from a noise or nightmare, just an overwhelming sense that something wasn't right. The air inside the cabin was cold and still. My sleeping bag was damp with condensation. I sat up and looked around. Nothing had changed. Nothing was missing, but something in the air felt different, like the place had settled around me overnight in a way I didn't like. I walked out into the woods to use the bathroom and noticed the remains of my campfire had been disturbed. The logs I'd arranged were scattered. My empty soup can was crushed flat. I looked around, thinking maybe a raccoon had come through, but I saw no prints, no signs of animal movement. Just the weird sense that someone had stood near the fire and moved things. Deliberately, I packed my gear again, ready to head out. I didn't like the feel of the place anymore, but when I reached the edge of the ridge to head down toward my car, I couldn't find the trail. The path I had marked with a piece of red cord was gone. Not cut, gone. The cord I'd tied to the branch was missing entirely, like it had never been there. I stood still for a long time, slowly turning in circles, trying to remember which direction the slope should have gone. But every direction looked wrong. The trees looked too thick, the ground too uneven. I walked a few hundred feet down one side and realized quickly I was going the wrong way. I turned back, walked another direction, and ended up in the same place, back at the cabin. I should have panicked. I should have screamed or run or done anything except what I did, which was convince myself I'd figure it out in the morning. I spent the rest of the day trying to map the area with sticks and stones, thinking I could orient myself by the sun the next morning. But the clouds came in thick, and by evening, I had no idea which way was which. I gave up and went back inside. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake listening to every groan of the old wood, every tiny scratch of something moving outside. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, not boots, not bare feet, just light, irregular thuds, like someone walking very slowly through the brush. I held my pistol against my chest and didn't move for hours. In the morning, I opened the door and saw something that stopped me cold. A pile of stones, neatly stacked just 10 feet from the cabin entrance. Each one was about the size of my fist, perfectly balanced. There were 5 of them, one on top of the other like a tiny tower. They hadn't been there the night before, and even if they had, I wouldn't have missed them. I stared at them for a long time. I walked around them in a wide circle. I didn't touch them. I tried again to find my way out that day. I used the compass on my watch and headed due east, marking trees every 20 feet with notches from my hatchet. After 3 hours of walking, I saw something that made my stomach sink. Another cabin, or maybe the same one, but this one looked more broken, more decayed. The roof was almost entirely collapsed. The boards looked darker, wetter. There were bones scattered in the grass around it. Small animal ones, maybe deer or raccoon. I didn't go inside. I didn't even go close. I just turned around and walked in a straight line back the way I came, and wound up back at the first cabin again. That night, I boarded the door with old planks and rusty nails I found in the corner. I closed the broken window with a sheet of plastic from my bag and kept the pistol beside me. I heard movement outside all night, soft rustling, cracks of branches, and what sounded like something breathing near the wall. In the morning, I found another pile of rocks, this one directly outside the window. 7 stones this time, taller, narrower. I snapped. I started yelling. Not words, just raw sound. I kicked the rocks. I threw one into the trees. I tore down part of the door I'd nailed shut and stormed into the forest in a random direction. I don't know how long I walked. Hours, maybe. I drank all my water. My legs cramped. My hands were shaking. But eventually I found it. A dirt road. Old, cracked, and full of weeds, but still a road. I followed it for what felt like forever, and just before sunset, I saw a hunting shack with an old ATV beside it. There was no one there, but the ATV had gas. I left a note and took it. I drove until I saw real pavement, and then another 40 miles until I found a ranger station. I filed a report, told them about the cabin, about the stone piles, about getting lost. They said they'd look into it. I gave them the GPS coordinates from my watch. They said it was national forest land, not supposed to have any structures on it. A week later, they emailed me to say they found nothing.
No cabin. No clearing. No woods.
No sign of anything. I don't go camping anymore, and I still think about those stones. Who put them there? Or why? Or worse, how they always knew exactly where I'd sleep next. My name is Owen. I'm 39 years old, and I work maintenance for a small construction firm in Leeds. What happened to me 3 years ago is something I've never told anyone. It happened far away from here, down in Norfolk, in a spot not even most locals talk about anymore. Back then, I was trying to get away from the noise and stress of my job and the mess I'd made of my marriage. I wanted time alone. No phones, no people, just space. That's how I ended up in that cabin behind Bracken Lane Cemetery. I'd found the listing on a site that catered to off-grid rentals. No electricity, no plumbing, no problem. The place was described as rustic, with wood-burning heat and a nearby well. The cabin sat on a private piece of land that bordered a decommissioned graveyard. The ad made it sound like a peaceful retreat. I was tired of the usual spots and sick of pretending to be okay. I booked 2 weeks and drove out there in late September of 2022. The cemetery itself was small, maybe 30 headstones in all, surrounded by a sagging wrought iron fence. The trees around it had started to bend inward with age, their branches dry and bare like crooked fingers. The cabin stood on the other side of a small hill, just a few hundred feet past the back edge of the graveyard, hidden in a pocket of thick woods. The area hadn't seen regular care in a long time, maybe decades. Leaves and brambles covered the trail so completely I missed the turnoff at first. There were no signs, just a gap in the brush and a mossy rope tied to a tree stump to mark the path. The cabin itself looked worse than the photos. Gray wood warped by time and moisture, shingles missing from the roof. A rusted stovepipe leaned like a bent elbow from the roof's edge. But it was standing, and the door held when I pushed on it. I was tired from the drive and didn't care about comfort. I just wanted quiet. I unloaded my bag, brought in my food and supplies, and set up camp on the floor with my sleeping mat and a thick wool blanket. The only furniture left was a chair with a cracked leg and a low shelf nailed to the wall near the wood stove. The first few days were uneventful. I'd brought a book and a journal, though I rarely wrote in it. Mostly I walked the woods and thought about how badly I'd screwed up my life. Being alone helped. I cooked over the wood stove, cleaned myself at the well using a steel bucket, and slept hard each night. The nights were cold and silent, except for the wind scraping the cabin and the occasional animal sounds. But it wasn't until the 5th night that I started noticing things that didn't sit right. It began with the tree bark. I'd been collecting firewood when I noticed long, deep scrapes on one of the birches behind the cabin. They weren't natural splits or weather marks. These were deliberate, cut in low, jagged lines like someone had dragged a heavy nail or metal tool through the wood. At first, I thought maybe an animal had done it, a deer or badger, but the marks were too long and too even, and they were fresh. No rot or dryness at the edges. Later that same day, I found a path I hadn't noticed before. It led from behind the cabin downhill toward the cemetery. I'd walked near it several times already, but this path had been hidden under dead leaves and sticks, almost like someone had swept it clear just recently. It was narrow and curved gently, like a footpath made from regular use. I followed it slowly, not because I was scared, but because something about it felt off. Too neat, too planned. It ran parallel to the main trail but never crossed it. When I reached the cemetery fence, I stopped and looked around. The air was still and I didn't hear any animals, no birds either. That wasn't normal. The graves inside the fence were old. Most of the headstones were cracked or leaning. Some had fallen completely. One thing I did notice, almost all the names had been scratched out or worn away. Not by time, not naturally, like someone had come along with a chisel or blade and removed them. There were no signs of care.
No flowers, no offerings, no candles.
Just stone and overgrowth. A single line of small wooden stakes sat behind the last row of graves, right up against the woods. They were short, maybe knee-height, and each one was topped with a rusted nail bent sideways. That night, I didn't sleep well. The wind sounded different, more like breathing than anything else. I tried to convince myself I was just spooking myself from being alone too long, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I found boot prints behind the cabin. They weren't mine. I know that for a fact because I'd worn the same hiking boots every day since I arrived, and my prints were heavy, worn down, and wider. These were narrow and deep. Someone had walked up to the back of the cabin, paused at the wall near the woodpile, then turned and walked back down toward the path. I followed them as far as I could, but the trail disappeared under fallen leaves before the cemetery. I should have left then, but I didn't. I didn't want to admit that I was scared. I didn't want to call the owner or go back into town like some coward. So I stayed. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe the owner came to check in and didn't want to bother me. That night, I locked the door with the old iron latch, set a fire in the stove, and kept my flashlight close. At around 2 in the morning, I heard movement. Not animal sounds, not wind, footsteps, slow and deliberate. I sat up and listened, holding my breath. The steps stopped just outside the door. I couldn't see anything from the small window.
No flashlight, no lantern.
Just blackness. Then came the sound I still can't forget. Breathing. Not loud but steady. Right outside. As if someone was standing with their face near the door. Then I heard fingers brush the wood, scraping up and down like someone feeling the grain. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. After what felt like an hour, the sound stopped. I sat there with my back to the wall and waited for light. The next morning, I stepped outside with my pocket knife in hand. There were no prints, nothing. The leaves on the ground were untouched. The woodpile hadn't shifted. I checked the latch, it was still locked from the inside. But just above the door frame, someone had carved something into the wood. 3 straight lines. They weren't there the day before. I checked the other side of the cabin, nothing. I didn't know what the marks meant, if anything, but they made my stomach twist. I told myself again it was probably vandals or teenagers. Maybe the land wasn't as private as I'd been told. I packed some things and drove 30 minutes into the nearest village, bought a cheap motion sensor alarm from a general hardware shop, and set it up on the trail behind the cabin. I placed it low so it wouldn't catch animals. That night, the alarm went off twice. The first time was just past midnight. I jumped up, flashlight in hand, and ran outside. Nothing. The light on the sensor blinked red, meaning it had caught movement. But there was no one there. I reset it and went back inside. It went off again an hour later. The next morning, I found a dead rabbit nailed to one of the trees near the trail. It was fresh, not eaten, just nailed there high enough that a normal animal couldn't reach. It hung by its back legs, stiff and dripping. I took it down and buried it. I didn't sleep at all that night. On day 10, I found something new. Behind the wooden stakes in the cemetery, those ones with the bent nails on top, there was a small, square depression in the ground, like a grave but shallower. I cleared away the leaves and found a flat stone slab. Not a headstone, just a marker with no name. Just a line of symbols I didn't recognize, lines, circles, and crosses. Underneath it, the dirt was loose. I left it alone. That evening, I heard hammering, not far off, slow and dull, like someone tapping a nail into wood. It came from the direction of the cemetery. Then it stopped. By then, I'd had enough. I packed my gear, stuffed everything into my rucksack, and made for the car. It was already dusk, and the woods seemed to close in on me with every step. I didn't run, but I moved fast. When I got to the car, I stopped short. The back window had been smashed. The inside was soaked, like someone had poured water in through the gap. My maps were gone. My food was scattered in the back seat. I didn't know if someone was watching me or had already left, but I didn't care. I turned the ignition and drove straight out of there. I didn't report anything. I didn't call the owner. I didn't speak a word of it to anyone. I just went back to my flat in Leeds and tried to forget. For weeks after, I kept waking up to the sound of hammering. I even installed a camera outside my door. Nothing ever showed up, but I always had the feeling that someone had followed me. Months later, out of stupid curiosity, I tried to look up the history of Bracken Lane Cemetery. There wasn't much. It had closed in the 1950s. The land changed hands a few times after that, mostly forgotten. No records of new burials. But I did find an old archived article from 1974. It was just a small clipping. It mentioned a missing local boy, 11 years old, last seen walking home near the cemetery. His name was never found, same as the others. They had all been scrubbed clean. I don't go camping anymore. I stay indoors close to people. I keep lights on at night. I still don't know who was out there, but I know they were real. I saw the signs. I felt them, and I still remember the sound of that hammer. One slow hit at a time, like someone building something, or nailing something shut. Maybe a box, maybe a door, maybe a grave. It was October 2013, and I had just turned 31. That year had been rough. My construction business in Manchester was collapsing under debt. My longtime girlfriend had moved out without a word, and my older brother, Owen, had passed away unexpectedly from a heart condition none of us knew he had. I felt like I had nothing left holding me in place anymore, so I took a break. Not the kind people post about on social media with yoga retreats or beaches. I wanted something quiet, isolated. I found it on a tired old forum about remote properties in Northumberland. Some guy had posted pictures of an abandoned logging cabin deep in a patch of wooded hills near the Scottish border. He said it used to be used by timber crews decades ago and that there were no trails leading up to it anymore. No one went out that way now. Sounded perfect. I didn't ask anyone for permission. I just saved the coordinates, packed my old backpacking gear, and drove north from Manchester, hitting the back roads past Alnwick until the Saturn AV gave up entirely. From there, I followed a faded logging road on foot, the kind with moss growing between tire ruts and puddles that looked like they hadn't dried up in months. The cold settled in my fingers and toes early. That part of the country doesn't ease into autumn, it crashes into it. The sky always looked like it was thinking about raining, even when it didn't. After about 5 hours of walking uphill and through thorny overgrowth, I found the cabin. It looked worse than I expected. Slanted to one side with broken eaves and a front step half sunk into the earth. The windows had been boarded up badly, but most of the wood had warped. It was made of thick pine logs that had darkened over time, stained by decades of weather and rot. The roof still held, but only barely. There were patches of daylight poking through. I dropped my pack outside and stood there for a long time. Something about it didn't feel right. Not haunted or anything like that. Just wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I forced myself inside anyway. The door groaned open like a reluctant mouth, but it didn't fall off. Inside, the place smelled like wet leaves and soot. An old stove sat crooked in the corner, rusted over and useless. There was a table and one chair still standing. Everything else had been either broken down or stolen. No insulation, no electricity, no plumbing. Just 4 walls, a roof, and whatever I brought in with me. I didn't unpack much. Just a sleeping mat, some food, a torch, and a folding knife I kept on me since college. There was no reception that far out, and I didn't bring any electronics beyond an old Nokia burner phone that was basically dead weight by then. That first night, I lay down early. The silence was total.
No owls.
No wind, just a thick, pressing quiet. I stared at the ceiling through the hole above my head and watched clouds drift by through patches of dark sky. I didn't fall asleep for hours. The next morning, I tried to settle in. I boiled water over a small camping stove and made instant coffee. I planned to stay 3 days, maybe 4 if the weather held. I had packed enough food for 5. After breakfast, I walked the woods. The land up there was rough and uneven. Lots of loose shale underfoot and fallen trees.
No trails anymore.
No signs of people. That's what I wanted. I found a stream about 1 kilometer north of the cabin and marked the way with a bit of red tape tied to a branch. The water was freezing but clear. I filled 2 bottles and returned around mid-afternoon. The cabin didn't look the same when I came back. I didn't notice at first, just something subtle. The door was slightly more open than I'd left it. One of the boards on the far window had fallen off, but it was old. Could have happened in the wind, I told myself. Still, I stood outside for 5 minutes, watching it like an animal unsure of the den it had crawled into. When I went inside, I found nothing had been taken or touched. My mat and gear were still exactly where I left them. That night, the wind picked up. It whistled through the cracks in the roof and the walls like someone breathing slowly. I lay awake again, wrapped tight in a thermal blanket, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of wood above my head made my skin tighten. At one point, I heard something tap along the far wall outside. It wasn't fast, just a dull scrape, then nothing. I waited a long time before I fell asleep. The next morning, I noticed prints in the mud outside the cabin. Not boots, bare feet. They weren't clear, like full heel-to-toe impressions, but they were too big for an animal. The toes were spaced out, and the heels left shallow dips. I stood there staring at them, holding my water bottle and not drinking from it. I looked up at the woods. Still, nothing moved. I followed them a little. They led down the slope away from the cabin and then just vanished in a bed of dead leaves and pine needles. I couldn't tell how old they were. Maybe the mud held them overnight, maybe longer, but they hadn't been there when I arrived, and they weren't mine. I should have left right then, but I told myself what a lot of people probably do in moments like that. It was nothing. Maybe an old footprint that got uncovered in the rain. Maybe an animal had just stepped weird. Maybe I was tired and seeing what I wanted to see. I stayed. The third night was the worst. I cooked dinner early, beans, boiled rice, and jerky. I kept the fire low, then let it burn out. I didn't want light drawing anything near. I sat in the dark after that, just my small torch in my hand switched off, listening. Around midnight, I heard someone walking outside. This time it was clear. Steady footsteps, slow, spaced out, crunching in the leaves. The steps moved around the side of the cabin, then paused near the back. I held my breath and kept my hand on the knife in my lap. Then came the scraping again. It was near the far window, the one where the board had fallen off. Something brushed against the wall, like fingernails dragging lightly on old wood. Then silence. I didn't move for 2 hours. Eventually I slept, but it was the kind of sleep where your body shuts down before your brain does. I jolted awake at 4 a.m. to a sharp cracking noise. I switched on my torch. One of the cabin's boards had been snapped, split clean through, as if someone had kicked it or pulled it down with both hands. I didn't sleep again after that. At dawn, I packed everything. I didn't eat. I didn't boil water. I just took what I could carry and left the rest. I didn't care if it cost me. I got out of there fast, heading back the way I came. About 20 minutes into the walk, I noticed something strange. It wasn't the trail, it was the feeling. The woods had gone quiet again, but this was different than before. Not peaceful, dead. Not a single bird. Not even wind. I looked behind me. First, nothing. Then, about 50 meters back, I saw a shape move between the trees. It was fast and low. Not running, but moving purposefully, as if it had been keeping pace with me and only now lost cover. I didn't stop walking, but I moved faster. I could feel the panic building in my chest. I didn't want to run, not yet. I just wanted distance. 5 minutes later, I looked back again. Closer. A man. Or at least a figure shaped like one. Shirtless. Pale. Filthy. Arms hanging strangely wide from his sides, as if he didn't know what to do with them. I didn't wait any longer. I ran. I ran until my legs burned. I tripped on roots, cut my hands open catching myself, got up again and kept running. No sound behind me,
No footsteps.
just that awful silence. I reached my car by nightfall. It was untouched, no sign of anything wrong. I got in, locked the doors, and drove until I reached the first petrol station with a signal. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't file a report. Who would believe me? I went home and didn't leave my flat for a week. Eventually, life crept back in. Bills, work, noise. The city has a way of muffling memories. But I never forgot that cabin. And I never forgot what I saw. A year later, I tried to find the post again on that forum. The one with the old pictures and coordinates. It was gone. The user's profile didn't exist anymore either. I've never been back to Northumberland since. I changed my number, my flat, even my car. For years, I kept a knife under my pillow. Not because I believed that man or whatever he was followed me, but because I remembered him. His posture, his silence, the way he watched from the tree line like he'd done it before. What scared me the most wasn't that he found me. It was that he didn't care if I saw him. Like he knew I wouldn't do anything about it. Like he knew I wouldn't be back. And he was right. I never will be. I was 39 when I went out to the Griale Valley alone. It was early October of 2014, and the air had just started to change. Cooler in the mornings, crisp and dry in the afternoons. I had been planning the trip for months. My cousin Alan and I had talked about going hunting together for years, but he'd taken a new job out east and couldn't get time off. I didn't want to wait anymore. I had time off work and a week with no commitments, so I packed up my gear and went alone. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to an old friend of my father's named Roy Simmons. I only met him a couple times when I was younger, but he had given my dad permission to use the place anytime. Roy passed away years ago, but the cabin still sat out there, tucked deep into the valley in North Yorkshire, about 2 hours from where I lived in Kendal. My dad hadn't gone there since the late 90s, but he said the key would still be in the same spot. under the third stone to the right of the porch steps. I loaded my truck with enough supplies for a week: water, dried food, propane for cooking, firewood, rifle, ammo, clothes, and my big orange hunting pack. I took a small hatchet, my skinning knives, a tarp, rope, and a couple trail cams just for fun. I wasn't planning anything too extreme. I just wanted peace, a few quiet days of hunting deer, and maybe some small game if nothing else came along. The drive was long and winding. I passed through a few small villages and then followed a narrow country road that eventually turned into gravel. From there, it was almost another hour of dirt paths through thick trees and rolling hills before I reached the base of Griale Valley. The truck took it fine, though I had to stop twice to move fallen branches. The cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The wood was gray and dry, the windows fogged with dust and pollen, but the roof was still solid, and the chimney looked clean. I found the key just where Dad said it would be and unlocked the door. The hinges creaked, but everything inside was intact, dusty but dry. There were 2 beds, a stone fireplace, a table with 3 chairs, and a few old shelves stacked with faded tin cans and yellowed maps. I spent the first hour just cleaning up and settling in. I opened all the windows and aired the place out. Then I started unpacking. The first night was calm. I built a small fire in the wood stove, cooked some canned stew, and went over the maps on the table. The area had trails crisscrossing for miles. There was a long ridge to the west and a stream cutting through the middle of the valley. I planned to head toward the eastern rise at dawn. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was scared or anything, but because the silence was so heavy. I wasn't used to that anymore. At home, there's always some hum. Traffic, neighbors, the fridge, something. Here, it was just wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I woke early, just before the sun rose, and made a quick breakfast. I dressed in layers, strapped on my rifle, and headed out with my day pack and binoculars. The forest felt different that morning, colder. Still, there was no birdsong, no rustling leaves. I walked the first mile in total silence, the kind of quiet that makes your footsteps feel too loud. I hiked up the east slope and stopped at a clearing that overlooked the lower valley. I sat there for a while, glassing the hills. Around noon, I saw movement, 3 deer cutting along the tree line below. I waited until they were gone and then followed the slope down to get a better view of where they'd been moving. That's when I found the first strange thing. At the base of a tree, right where the deer had passed, there was a little pile of bones. Clean bones. Not bleached white like from years of weather, but fresh, still a little red in places. Squirrel, maybe rabbit, but they were arranged too neatly, not scattered or chewed, just stacked in a tight spiral, almost like a coil. I didn't like it. I'm not superstitious, but animals don't usually do that. Not unless something or someone put them there. I nudged them with a stick, then kept walking. Over the next few hours, I followed tracks and signs, but didn't get a shot. The forest felt off. That's the only way I can put it. I felt watched. More than once, I stopped and looked around because I was sure something was moving behind me, just out of sight. Once, I even circled back to check my own trail, thinking maybe someone else was out there. But there was no one. No sign of anyone. The woods were too quiet. By late afternoon, I made my way back toward the cabin. I marked a couple promising spots to return to the next day, but I was tired and wanted to eat and warm up. When I reached the clearing around the cabin, something made me stop. The front door was open. I knew I had closed it. I remembered the feel of the latch, the sound it made. I didn't think I'd locked it, but I'd definitely shut it. Now it was half open, swaying gently. I crept closer, one hand on my rifle, and peered inside. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. But something had changed. On the table, someone had placed a smooth rock. Round, flat, the size of a small plate. It hadn't been there before. I cleared that table myself. Now it sat dead center, with a single black feather laid on top of it. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, staring at it, trying to think. Could someone have passed through? Some hiker? But the area was remote, way off any public path. No other tire tracks. No fresh footprints near the porch. I shut and locked the door, then checked every window. I pulled the blinds and built up the fire. I didn't eat much that night. I just sat by the fire with my rifle across my lap, listening. And around midnight, I heard it. A sound outside, soft, like fabric brushing across wood. Then a thump. Then silence again. I didn't move. I didn't open the door. I just sat there, staring at the crack under the door where a sliver of moonlight slipped in. Nothing else happened that night, but I didn't sleep. The next day, I thought about leaving, but I also didn't want to seem crazy. Maybe I was just rattled. Maybe it was some bird that brought that feather. Maybe the rock had always been there and I just forgot. I told myself all kinds of things. I ate a little, then headed out again, this time toward the western ridge. I found more bones. This time, they were hanging from a tree. Tiny bird skulls strung together with what looked like fishing line, dangling from a branch like a wind chime. 5 of them, all spinning gently in the breeze. Below it, scratched into the dirt, were several lines that looked like tally marks. Deep grooves. 8 of them. I turned around and went back to the cabin immediately. This time, the door was locked just as I left it. Nothing new inside. The feather and stone were still on the table, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I stayed inside the rest of the day. I cooked, I cleaned my gear, I made coffee even though I didn't want any, just to feel normal. That night, the sound came again. More than one sound this time. First, a scraping along the side of the cabin. Then a low, dragging noise across the porch. Then a faint thud, as if something leaned or fell against the wall. I held my rifle tight and moved to the window, keeping the light low. I peeked through the slats. There was a man standing in the clearing. He was maybe 50 feet from the porch, facing the cabin. Not moving, just standing still in the shadows, not trying to hide but not doing anything either. I couldn't see his face clearly. He wore a long jacket, dark pants, maybe boots. His arms hung loose at his sides. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. When I finally looked again, he was gone. That was the last night I spent there. At dawn, I packed everything. Fast, sloppy, I didn't care. I didn't eat. I didn't brush my teeth. I just loaded the truck and left. I didn't even bother locking the door. I looked back once, and that flat rock with the feather was still sitting on the table. Felt like it was watching me leave. I made it back to Kendall by early afternoon. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't want to explain it. I didn't want to hear their theories. A few months later, I went back to check on the cabin, but this time with Alan and 2 others. We found the place completely burned down, charred to the ground, not even a frame left standing. The fire hadn't spread to the trees, just the cabin, as if someone had lit it carefully and watched it burn. No one claimed responsibility. No fire department reports. No storms or lightning. Just a blackened patch of earth and that strange silence hanging in the air again. I haven't gone hunting since. I don't know who or what was in those woods. I don't care anymore. I don't want to know. But every so often, when I'm walking down a quiet street at night or driving through a wooded lane, I catch the scent of smoke and earth, and I swear I hear a faint scraping sound again, somewhere just behind me. I don't turn around. I just keep walking. My name's Darren Westbrook. I was 36 when it happened, and I hadn't thought about it in years until now. It happened back in 2018, up in the hills north of Taos, New Mexico. I'd taken a week off from work to spend time in a cabin that used to belong to my uncle. He died the year before, and the place sat empty since. It wasn't much, just a square wooden thing with one main room, a small kitchen, and a toilet that flushed only if the water tanks hadn't frozen. But it was quiet, and I needed that. I worked construction back then, the kind of work that grinds your back down to dust. My marriage had ended a couple of years earlier, and I wasn't good at dealing with the leftover silence. The cabin felt like a way to breathe again. I hadn't been up there since I was a kid, not since we'd visit in the summers and chop wood for fun. It sat 5 miles from the nearest dirt road and took about an hour to hike in once you parked. Cell signal was a joke, and I liked that. I left Albuquerque early that Sunday morning, stopped for supplies in Espanola, and reached the trail by mid-afternoon. I packed light but enough: 2 weeks of canned food, a small gas stove, a rifle, a revolver, and a solar battery pack for a headlamp and small lantern. It was fall and the days were still warm, but the nights had that dry mountain cold that made your teeth hurt. The hike up was quiet. I didn't see a single person or animal. I remember how loud the crunch of my boots sounded on the dried needles and gravel. When I reached the cabin, I expected it to feel familiar, but it didn't. It felt off, like someone had touched every surface just enough to unsettle it. The lock was rusted but still held. I had the old key my uncle left me before he died. He passed from a stroke sudden on his ranch 2 counties over. He hadn't been up to the cabin in almost 4 years. Inside, everything was still there. Blankets folded, wood stacked by the stove. A photo of my aunt still hanging crooked above the table. The air smelled stale but not wrong, just untouched. I opened the windows, dusted off what I could, and made a small fire in the wood stove once the sun dipped down. I ate a can of chili, drank 2 bottles of water, and sat on the creaky couch with my boots still on. It wasn't until the second night that things started to shift. I had been chopping firewood near the edge of the tree line, about 50 yards behind the cabin. The place was surrounded by ponderosa and piñon, thick and dark enough that the sunlight faded quickly once it hit the tree line. Around 6, I heard movement deeper in the woods. I figured it was a mule deer or maybe a bear, so I grabbed my rifle and waited. Nothing came out. That night, I lay in bed with the fire low, the shadows stretching long across the cabin walls. I kept hearing something walking outside, not circling exactly, but stepping slowly. 1 step, then silence, then another step. Dry twigs snapping, leaves moving. It wasn't the wind. The wind moves through things. This sound paused like it was thinking. I didn't go outside. By the 5th night, I stopped sleeping much. Every night the steps came back, and now I was noticing more. One afternoon, I walked up the ridgeline just to scout the area and stretch my legs. There's a rocky outcrop where the trees thin out, and from there you can look down into the whole valley, even spot the cabin's roof through the breaks. When I turned to head back, I saw someone standing by the tree line near the cabin. They were facing the cabin wall, standing perfectly still. I was about a 1/4 mile away, but I could tell they weren't moving at all.
Not which.
No shift of weight, just still. I crouched low and watched for a long time. After what felt like 10 minutes, they slowly turned and walked back into the trees. I hiked back fast, rifle in hand. When I reached the cabin, I circled it. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing. That night, I locked the cabin door. I normally didn't bother. My uncle never used to, but something felt wrong. It was the 6th night that did it for me. I woke up around 3 in the morning. No reason, just that kind of alert wake up where your body's already stressed. The fire had died, and the cabin was cold. I sat up, pulled the blanket over my shoulders, and listened. There was breathing outside. It was steady, not animal-like panting, human-like, controlled, calm, close. I sat still on the bed, rifle leaned against the wall next to me. I didn't move for maybe a minute. Then I heard it again, this time closer to the window. I reached for the rifle, slow. The window was fogged.
No curtain.
Just glass and the cold beyond. I saw nothing, but the breathing didn't stop. And then it did something that made my heart slam through my ribs. It mimicked a cough. Not a deep one, just a little throat clear. The kind of thing I do when I wake up. Same sound, same pattern. It was mine. I stayed frozen. Rifle aimed at the window, finger just near the trigger. Nothing moved for another 5 minutes. Then something scraped against the wall. A hand, maybe. Nails. It didn't sound like metal or wood. It sounded like skin on wood. I didn't go outside. I sat there until the sun came up. When I opened the door, there were no prints.
No marks.
Nothing. I knew I should have left then, but I told myself I was imagining it. I wanted to believe it was stress, or loneliness, or wind. The mind plays tricks in silence. But I knew better. The 7th day, I left the cabin to hike south, to where a small creek ran through a ravine. I figured I'd hunt some rabbits or just move around a bit to get my blood flowing. The place was too quiet again. Even birds weren't moving. That's when I saw the tracks. Not boot prints, bare feet, human feet but not quite right. Too long in the toes. The ball of the foot too pronounced. It looked like someone had dragged the pads of their feet while walking, as if they didn't know how to lift them properly. They were deep too deep for a person walking lightly. They led toward the cabin. I followed them back up the hill, rifle in hand, breathing sharp through my nose. I didn't run, but I didn't waste time either. When I reached the clearing, I saw something move near the outhouse. Just a blur, like someone ducking behind the shed. I shouted out, not with words, just a noise, and raised the rifle. Nothing moved. I checked around the shed, behind the woodpile, inside the outhouse. Empty, but there was a smell. Something thick, metallic and sour, like dried blood mixed with wet dog. I didn't sleep that night either. The final day, I made the mistake of trying to trap it. I set up a tripwire by the cabin door, connected to an old string of bear bells my uncle used to hang. I placed flour by the window and doorway to catch prints. I sat by the stove all night, waiting, rifle across my lap. At some point after midnight, I must have dozed off. I woke to the sound of the bells rattling. Not loud, just a faint, slow jingle. I grabbed the rifle and swung toward the door. Nothing, but the flour was disturbed. Long prints, not boots. I stood, heart racing, and turned toward the window. There was a face looking in. It was mine. Not similar, not close.
Mine.
The same crease above the brow. Same cheekbone scar I got from a drywall accident 10 years ago. But the eyes were wrong. Too black, too flat, no shine in them. Pulled back slowly, vanishing into the night. I opened the door, rifle up, and stepped out. The cold bit into me. The moon was low, just barely above the trees, and the whole world felt carved out of frost. I heard nothing. Then I heard footsteps behind me.
Ispun.
No one there, but the door was now open behind me again. I had shut it. I know I had. I backed inside and bolted the lock. My heart wouldn't slow. I aimed the rifle at the door and stayed there until dawn. I packed everything the next morning and left. I didn't care that my food wasn't finished or that I'd hiked 5 miles in. I didn't care. When I reached my truck, there were prints around it. Barefoot. Same dragging walk. I drove until I reached cell service. I didn't stop. Weeks later, I got a call from the Forest Service. They'd found the cabin door open. They asked if I'd left it that way. I said maybe. They said they'd found deer carcasses nearby. Skinned clean, but with no cuts. Just peeled. I never went back. Every now and then I hear a cough in the middle of the night, and it sounds like mine. But I live alone, and the windows don't lock. I was 34 the year I took a break from everything. It was 2017. I had burned out completely from work, from the noise of Manchester, from the routines that ate away every day. I'd split from my girlfriend about 7 months before, and even though the breakup had been mutual, it left something heavy in me, a hollow weight. I'd lie on my back at night in the dark thinking I was still waiting for life to start, which didn't make sense at that age, but it's how I felt. I ended up booking a cabin near Loch Dochart in Scotland, not far from the English border, still technically the UK, but out where barely anyone would think to go. I wanted complete quiet, somewhere that didn't remind me of office walls, traffic lights, or messages I hadn't replied to. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no signal, and was a solid 40-minute drive from the nearest town, Killen. The place had looked perfect in the photos. One main room with a fireplace and kitchenette, a small bedroom with a single bed, and a deck that overlooked a shallow forest slope leading to a marshy loch. The property was surrounded by thick woods. I booked it for 10 days, figuring I'd spend the time reading, chopping wood, walking trails, maybe doing nothing at all. The drive there was long, longer than I thought. The last hour was along a narrow country road that kept dipping and twisting around hills. My phone dropped signal 20 minutes from the turnoff. I remember that because I was in the middle of a podcast and it just cut out and never came back. I didn't even realize how much I relied on that background noise until it disappeared. The silence pressed in slowly, like fog. The cabin stood down a dirt path off the main road. A wooden sign nailed to a tree said Rowan Edge. No one had lived around there in years. The nearest property was an old farmstead half a mile back the way I came. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Complete stillness. It was cold, too. Early October. You could smell damp moss and dry pine needles, like the world had paused. Inside, the cabin was exactly like the pictures, old but sturdy, the kind of place someone built by hand and never left. I noticed a few personal items still on the shelves, some faded paperbacks, a carved wooden bird on the mantel, a rusted old compass hanging by a nail in the kitchen. The person who owned it had probably died or moved away long ago, and now it was just something people passed through. I unpacked, chopped a bit of wood behind the cabin, and got the fire going. That night, the first one, I slept hard. No car sounds, no neighbor footsteps above me, no blue glow of devices. Just dark and the wind brushing the walls. The second day passed peacefully. I took a long walk through the trees, found an old logging road half overgrown with grass, and followed it until the shadows started to stretch. Nothing strange. Just me, birds, wind. But on the third day, things shifted. I woke up early and made tea, then stepped out onto the deck with the mug. The sun wasn't up yet, just a dull gray light soaking through the mist over the trees. I looked down the slope toward the loch and saw something that made me stop. There was a woman standing near the tree line. She wasn't moving, just standing. She was far enough that I couldn't make out her face. Maybe 40 or 50 meters, but I could see her shape clearly through the mist. She wore dark clothes, maybe a coat or shawl, and her hair looked long. She was looking directly up at the cabin. I stood there with the mug halfway to my lips, frozen. I wasn't even sure what I was looking at first. I watched for a while, a minute, two. She didn't move. Eventually, I set the mug down and walked back inside. I didn't know what else to do. There was a part of me that said maybe she was a hiker, someone from a nearby cottage, though I hadn't seen any signs of life in the area. But it was early, and something about the way she stood didn't feel right. When I checked again an hour later, she was gone. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was seeing things. Shadows and fog can play tricks. I went on with my day, read for a while, did some drawing, took a nap, but I kept thinking about it. That woman, her stillness. That night, I made sure all the doors were locked. I kept checking out the windows, I turned off the lights and stood by the side window that looked down the slope. The moon had come up over the trees, and everything was bathed in that cold silver light. I didn't see anything, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, there were footprints outside the deck. It had rained lightly overnight, and the soft earth had recorded everything clearly. I saw my boot prints from the previous day walking to the woodpile and back, but now there was a second set. Bare feet, small, narrow, not mine. They came from the tree line, stopped at the base of the deck, turned away, and disappeared toward the forest again. I just stood there staring at them for what must have been 5 full minutes. I didn't know what to think. Who would be out here barefoot in October? It had been near freezing overnight. Was it a child? A drunk? A squatter? Nothing made sense. I followed the prints down the slope a little way, but they vanished in the undergrowth. I didn't want to go any farther. That day, I brought in extra firewood and kept a hatchet by the front door. I stayed mostly inside. The woods didn't feel the same anymore. I kept glancing toward the windows like something was watching. When I finally went to bed, I propped a chair under the door handle, even though it had a lock. At some point deep in the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't hear anything, but I felt it, like a shift in the air, a wrongness. I got up, heart already beating fast, and crept into the main room. The front window had fogged slightly from the inside, but I could see it. A pale face pressed against the glass. Not a mask, a real face, a woman's face. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking. She wasn't trying to get in, just staring, inches from the window. I couldn't move. I don't know how long she stood there, but at some point, she turned and disappeared back into the dark. I didn't sleep again. I kept every light on, the fire going, sat in the wooden chair with the hatchet in my lap, listening. I didn't hear footsteps.
No knock, no scream.
Just the wind outside and the crackling logs. In the morning, I searched the perimeter. No sign of anything.
No prints.
I don't know how she disappeared so fast. I stayed another day because I didn't know what else to do. It felt insane to call the police and tell them someone looked in my window in the woods. I had no proof, no names. I started thinking maybe I was losing it, that the silence was getting to me. But then something else happened. That evening, I noticed one of the paperbacks on the shelf had been moved. It sounds small, but I remembered placing it flat on the table that morning. Now it was upright in the shelf in between 2 others. I hadn't touched it. No one else was there. I tore the cabin apart after that. Checked under the bed, in the pantry, behind every panel. Nothing. The place was just one room and a small bedroom. There was nowhere to hide. That night, I didn't turn the lights off at all. I sat up again, too afraid to sleep. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard something move on the deck, just a creak. One board flexing under pressure. Then another. Then nothing. I didn't go to the window. I stayed in that chair gripping the hatchet until sunrise. The next morning, I walked out and saw it. A smear on the window, a handprint. It wasn't clean. It looked like dirt or sap, maybe even dried blood. 5 fingers, palm wide, smudged in a downward drag like whoever pressed it had leaned against the glass. That was it. I packed my things, threw them in the car, and left before noon. I didn't clean up. I didn't care about the deposit. I just drove. On the way back, I passed the wooden Rowan edge sign and noticed something carved into it. A series of lines, maybe initials I hadn't seen when I arrived. It looked old, weathered deep into the wood. It read, "She watches when it's quiet." I didn't stop. Back in Manchester, I tried to forget it. I went back to work, told no one, but it sat with me. That face, the stillness, the bare feet. A few months later, I looked the place up online again. The listing was gone. When I contacted the company I booked through, They said the property had been delisted after multiple complaints of trespassing and break-ins. No suspects were ever caught. I never found out who she was. All I know is what I saw. The still figure by the tree line, the footprints, the face at the window, the changed book, and that feeling deep in my gut that she never left those woods. That whoever she was, she didn't want help. She didn't want to be found. She just wanted to be seen. And I saw her. It was 2014, and I was 29 when I decided to leave the noise behind for a while and take on something quiet, something real. I had been working construction jobs in Leeds for almost 9 years straight, hammering away at other people's dreams while living in a flat I barely had time to sleep in. I was tired. I didn't want to break in a hotel or a beach somewhere. I wanted something that made my hands sore and my back stiff for a reason that felt like mine. That's when I thought of the land my uncle left me. It sat right near a place called Birch Hollow, about an hour outside Dumfries in southern Scotland. He died in 2009, left behind a patch of land nobody in the family had any use for. No plumbing, no power, no driveway. Just trees, uneven earth, and a few trails left behind by animals that didn't care who owned what. I had this idea. I'd build myself a small cabin on that land. Just me, some tools, some timber, and time. I gave myself 2 weeks off work, packed up my van with as much wood and hardware as I could fit, and drove out early on a Tuesday morning. It rained most of the way up. I didn't mind the rain. I liked the sound of it on the roof of the van, liked how it softened everything in the distance. I kept thinking how nice it'd be to sit inside a cabin I built with my own hands, listening to rain just like this. The turnoff for Birch Hollow was barely marked. I'd only been to the land once before, years ago, when my uncle was still alive. There wasn't a proper path, just a rough track that curved through some dense trees and ended in what looked like a clearing. I had to park the van about 200 yards away and carry everything by foot. It took 3 trips just to get the basics over. I had a simple plan. I'd build a one-room shelter, enough space for a cot, a stove, and a small workbench. I brought a tarp for cover in case the weather turned worse. My tools were basic: a hand saw, a few hammers, a drill, and a foldable work table.
No generators. No concrete mixers.
Just what I could carry and use alone. The first day went slow. The ground was softer than I remembered, uneven in places, and I had to clear more brush than I expected. By mid-afternoon, my hands were raw and my shoulders ached, but I had the first set of posts sunk into the ground. I rigged the tarp between 2 trees and lay on a bedroll, listening to the wind in the branches. That night, the rain came back heavy. It rattled the tarp, pooled in the corners, and soaked through my boots where they sat outside. I stayed mostly dry, but I didn't sleep much. Something about the dark out there felt heavier than it should have, like the trees were leaning in closer than they had during the day. The second day, I framed out the floor and started building up the walls. The rain came in bursts, and every time I looked over my shoulder, I thought I saw something between the trees, a movement, a shape, but I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a fox. I kept my head down and worked. There was no phone signal. I'd known that going in, but it started to weigh on me. I had no way to check the weather, no way to call for help if I got hurt. I kept telling myself it was fine, that this was what I wanted, just me and the woods and the rain. But that night, something strange happened. I had just zipped into my sleeping bag when I heard it. A dull sound, repeated, soft but deliberate, like someone tapping a hammer on wood. It was coming from behind the tarp, toward where I'd stacked the timber. I sat up and held my breath. The sound came again. 3 knocks, then silence. I didn't move, didn't say anything. I just listened. Nothing. After 10 minutes, I unzipped the flap and stepped out with my flashlight. The beam cut through the rain, lit up the piles of wood, the work table, the frame of the cabin. Nothing out of place. But the next morning, 2 planks were missing. I know I didn't move them. I had counted everything when I stacked it. I told myself I'd made a mistake. Maybe I miscounted. Maybe I moved them while working and forgot. I forced myself to focus on the structure. I raised the first wall by mid-afternoon. The wind picked up, pushed against the tarp, rattled the branches above me. By the 5th day, I had 3 walls up and half a roof. I was tired. My lower back felt like someone had hit it with a metal rod. My hands were cut up and blistered, and the feeling that I wasn't alone hadn't gone away. I kept hearing things, light steps on wet leaves, the crunch of twigs when I wasn't moving. I stopped whistling while I worked, stopped singing to myself. I kept looking over my shoulder every few minutes. Then, on the 6th night, it happened again. The knocking, only this time it was closer, just outside the frame of the cabin. Same pattern, 3 slow knocks. I sat up in the dark, reached for my flashlight, and shined it toward the noise. Nothing, but this time I noticed something in the mud near the wall. A mark, like someone had dragged something heavy. A line through the wet dirt. It led off into the trees and vanished. The next morning, more wood was gone. A full stack this time, about 5 or 6 planks I'd left leaning against the sidewall. I looked around for prints, for signs of animals. Nothing clear, just more of those drag lines, faint in the mud, like something had been hauled away. I thought about leaving. I could pack up, hike back to the van, and forget the whole thing. But something kept me there. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness. Maybe I just needed to finish the damn thing. On the 7th night, I stayed awake. I turned off my lantern early, lay still in the dark with my knife beside me. The wind howled through the trees. The rain came in waves. Then I heard it. Not the knocking this time. Breathing, just outside the wall. Slow, wet, steady. Like someone standing close, trying not to be heard but not far enough away. I didn't move. My heart was hammering. The breathing lasted a full minute, maybe more. Then it stopped. In the morning, I found footprints, bare feet, human, leading away from the cabin into the woods. I didn't know what to think. I hadn't seen a soul since I got there. No nearby cabins, no hikers. Who walks barefoot through soaked woods in the rain? Who steals timber, then comes back just to breathe near your wall at night? I worked faster after that. I pushed through the pain and the fear. I got the roof up, sealed the sides, nailed the planks tight and fast. I didn't care about perfect cuts anymore. I just wanted for solid walls between me and whatever was out there. By the 10th day, the cabin was standing, crude but solid. I had a cot inside, a camping stove, and my tools hung up on a board. The last night I spent inside it, the rain hit the roof like drums. It was a different sound than the tarp, deeper, heavier. But I still didn't sleep, because sometime after midnight, something scratched the wall. Not hard, just enough to be heard. A slow, dragging sound. Fingertips, maybe, circled once, then again. Then it stopped. In the morning, I packed everything. Left the tools. Left the stove. I hiked back to the van through mud up to my shins. I didn't look back. 2 weeks later, I got a call from a ranger up in that area. They'd found a small lean-to deeper in the woods, maybe half a mile from my cabin. Inside were some of the planks that had gone missing, pile of them, and next to them, a sleeping bag, filthy and torn. A notebook too. They wouldn't let me see what was in it. Just said it looked like someone had been living out there for a long time. They asked me if I'd seen anyone. I said no. I didn't say anything about the knocking or the breathing or the scratching. What would have been the point? I haven't gone back since. The cabin's still there as far as I know. Sometimes I wonder who was out there in the dark watching me build it, I wonder if they're still watching now. But mostly, I'm just glad I built the walls fast enough, and that I left when I did. My name is Richard. I was 36 when this happened. It was the fall of 2016. I had just lost my job in Newcastle and needed some time to regroup. My uncle, a quiet man who rarely spoke to anyone in the family unless he had to, had passed away 2 months earlier. He owned a small patch of land in Northumberland, out by Wooler, where he kept a few animals and a small cabin he'd built himself. It wasn't fancy, wood walls, tin roof, only 1 bedroom, but it had a fireplace and a small generator and was close to a well. He didn't live there full-time, just used it as a place to get away from the world. After he died, no one really wanted to deal with it, but I figured I could go up there, clean it out, maybe fix it up and get my head straight while I looked for work. The cabin sat about 2 miles off the main road, down a dirt track that cut through a field of dry grass and old stone walls. I drove up there in an old Ford Estate, packed with food, bottled water, a sleeping bag, some tools, and a notebook. I didn't expect to be there more than a week or 2. The plan was simple. Clean, take inventory, see if anything was worth keeping or selling, and get out. I got there just before sunset. The air smelled like wet leaves and mud. There was a light breeze that moved through the trees, and the place felt peaceful. I unlocked the door with the key my dad gave me and stepped inside. It was cold and smelled of old smoke and wood rot. Dust floated through the air like ash. There were mice droppings on the windowsills, cobwebs in the corners, and something like dried blood on one of the kitchen cabinets. Could have been rust. I didn't think too much of it. The first few days were uneventful. I swept the floors, aired the place out, cleaned the kitchen, and got the fireplace going. I didn't bother with the generator the first night. I lit some candles and sat on a folding chair, drinking from a thermos. I felt calm, like I was finally alone in a good way. There were some tools in the shed behind the cabin. My uncle had left an axe, a spade, and an old wheelbarrow that was half buried in weeds. I spent hours chopping dead branches and stacking firewood, fixing a loose shutter, replacing a broken hinge on the shed door. The work was good for me. I wasn't thinking about my job or my ex or anything, just the cold in my fingers and the warmth from the fire when I stepped back inside. But after the 3rd night, I started noticing little things. The first was the barn. There was a small livestock barn, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. It was made of old gray wood, and the door was off its hinges, leaning to one side. I hadn't gone near it at first because I figured there was nothing in there but tools and dust, but I kept hearing things from it. Not loud noises, just soft ones, like shuffling, a scrape here and there, the kind of sounds that are easy to ignore until they keep happening at the same time every night. It would usually start around 11 p.m. I'd be in the cabin trying to read or write or just lie still, and I'd hear it, a faint dragging sound, like something being pulled across the wooden floor of the barn. Not fast, slow, like it took effort. I thought maybe there was an animal in there, a fox or a badger, maybe even a sheep that wandered in somehow. But when I finally went to check it out during the day, the barn was empty. There were deep scratch marks on the inside of the door, long ones, uneven. They looked old, but they hadn't been there the day before. I stared at them for a long time. I didn't know what to make of it. I told myself it was nothing, just the kind of thing you overlook until you're alone and bored and your mind starts making things bigger than they are. That night, I locked the cabin door for the first time. A few days later, I found something under the porch. I dropped my hammer through a gap in the boards and had to crawl under to get it. It was dark, cold, and cramped. I had a torch in my mouth and was reaching for the hammer when I saw a pile of something in the corner. Small bones. Not animal bones, at least not ones I recognized. They were clean and dry, arranged in a tight little mound. Beside them was a piece of torn fabric, red and dirty, almost buried in the dirt. I pulled it out and brought it into the light. It was a child's shirt. Old. The color had almost faded completely. I threw it out. I told myself I wasn't a detective. I didn't want to call anyone because then they'd ask what I was doing there and drag the whole family into it. Maybe my uncle had found the shirt somewhere and forgot about it. Maybe the bones were animal. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But that night, the noises got louder. They didn't come from the barn anymore. They came from outside the cabin, from just beyond the trees, crunching leaves, footsteps. I stood at the window, peeking through the curtain, but there was no one there. I waited. Nothing. I went back to bed. At 3 a.m, I woke up to something slamming into the side of the cabin. Not hard, not enough to break anything, just one loud thud, like someone running into the wall. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the torch. I didn't see anything through the windows. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The wind had picked up and was tossing leaves across the clearing, but there was nothing else. I went around the cabin once, slowly, shining the light over every inch of grass and dirt. Nothing. I barely slept that night. Every creak and snap made me sit up straight. The next morning, I packed most of my things. I told myself I'd leave the following day, but I didn't. I don't really know why. Maybe part of me didn't want to be afraid of some old farm noises. Maybe I was stubborn. Maybe I felt like if I left now, I'd never stop running from things. I stayed. The next few days were worse. I started waking up to find things moved. The spade that had been leaning on the shed was now lying across the porch. My torch, which I always left beside the bed, was found outside in the wet grass. One morning, I found muddy footprints leading from the woods to the cabin, and then back. They were barefoot, adult-sized. I measured them with my own shoes. I didn't tell anyone. There was no phone signal out there. I didn't bring a laptop, and the old landline in the cabin hadn't worked in years. I could have driven back into town, but I didn't. Something had changed in me. I started walking the property with the axe in my hand. I checked every window twice before bed. I nailed the barn door shut. Then came the day I found the hole. I was walking along the edge of the field behind the cabin when I noticed the grass looked different in one patch. It was flattened. I kicked at it and found a piece of plywood buried under a layer of leaves and dirt. I pulled it up and found a hole beneath it. Pit more like, about 4 feet wide, maybe 6 feet deep. The sides were lined with old boards and the bottom was packed earth. There were scratch marks on the inside, fresh ones. I don't know how long I stood there. Felt like an hour. I covered it back up and walked straight inside the cabin. That night, I blocked the door with the table. I didn't sleep. At 2:40 a.m., something tried the handle. It was slow, careful. Click, then silence. Then another try. The handle turned a little, then stopped. I didn't move. I held the axe and waited. There was a dragging noise on the porch. Slow steps. Something moved along the side of the cabin, brushing against the walls. Then silence again. A minute passed. Then another. Then the sound of breathing right by the window. I stayed still. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up at dawn, still clutching the axe. That was the last night I stayed there. I packed everything in 10 minutes and drove out without looking back. I didn't even bother locking the door. Later, when I told my dad about it, he said my uncle had gotten strange in the last few years. Said he wouldn't let anyone visit the cabin. That he talked about people following him, watching from the trees. I don't know if any of it's true. The land's still there. The cabin too, probably. But I'll never go back. Some places should be left alone. I was 34 when it happened, working for a mid-sized construction firm based in western Wyoming. The company was mostly involved in rural projects, retaining walls, utility builds, ranch structures. Nothing fancy, but it paid the bills. My boss, Doug Merritt, was a guy in his early 50s. Quiet, always direct, always looking like he was thinking about 3 things at once. He wasn't a bad boss, didn't shout, paid overtime, but he kept things close to the chest, and most of us never really knew what went on in his head. In the spring of 2017, Doug told me he'd bought some property near the Idaho border, about 40 minutes west of a town called Winton's Gap. The company was slow that month, so he wanted to build a basic wood frame cabin out there. Nothing fancy, just a place to spend hunting season. He said he'd cover my hours if I helped him get the main structure up before the end of the month. I agreed. I didn't have kids, my rent was cheap, and frankly, I needed the money. We left early one Saturday morning in late March. The drive took nearly 5 hours. The last 1.5 spent grinding up a narrow gravel road that wound around some low forested hills. It wasn't deep wilderness, but it was definitely removed from anything nearby. No cell signal, no traffic, no houses. There were trees on both sides, dense pine and fir, and snow still clinging to the ground in shaded spots, even though the sun was out and the weather had started to shift towards spring. The property itself was about 4 acres of mostly flat ground in a clearing halfway up a hillside. There was a small shed already there, which Doug said he'd bought from the last owner. It was packed with tools, rolls of tarp, some old generators, and camping gear. Next to the shed, he had a stack of pressure-treated lumber dropped off by a local supplier the day before. We didn't waste time. Doug had a detailed drawing he'd made himself. 12 by 20 footprint, sloped roof, 1 door, 3 windows, propane heater in the corner, small wood stove to the side. He wanted to camp on site while we worked. I didn't argue. We set up 2 army-style cots inside the shed and used a cooler full of food Doug had packed. There was a freshwater stream about 200 feet downhill, and we ran a line with a little plastic drum to keep a steady trickle going. The first 2 days were long but clean. We got the posts set and the basic framing stood up. Nights were cold and still, but nothing strange. I remember sleeping light because the shed walls were thin and creaked when the wind kicked up. On the 3rd day, things started to feel off. It was small at first. I came out of the woods behind the shed after washing up in the stream and found a set of boot prints in the dirt near the front lumber pile. They weren't ours. Different sole pattern, slightly smaller size. I looked around, didn't see anyone. I mentioned it to Doug, and he didn't say much. He walked over, looked down, then dragged his boot over the prints and walked away. I thought maybe someone had come through while we were out back cutting cross beams or setting up the corner braces. Still, it stuck in my mind. The road to this place was rough. It was unlikely someone had just wandered through on foot. And even if they had, they didn't take anything, didn't leave anything behind. That night, it got colder than before. My sleeping bag was good down to 15 degrees, but I still woke up stiff and aching. Around 3 in the morning, I had to take a leak. I stepped out behind the shed with my flashlight and kept it low, not wanting to blind myself. I didn't see or hear anything, but just as I zipped up, I noticed the woods across the clearing looked darker than usual, not just shadowed, like there was something tall and wide blocking out some of the starlight through the trees. I stood still. Whatever it was didn't move. I told myself it was just a clump of spruce or a drift of darker rock. I went back in, told myself I was overreacting, and got under the bag again. Doug was already awake, laying still on his cot with his eyes open. He didn't say anything, and I didn't either. The next day was colder than expected. A front came in and the wind picked up. We spent most of it inside the half-built shell of the cabin, hammering down floorboards and cutting framing for the sidewalls. In the early afternoon, I noticed Doug was working faster, more tense. He wasn't talking or pausing to look at the plan like he usually did. He didn't eat lunch either. Around 4 p.m., He asked me to start getting the tarp stretched over the roof frame, even though we weren't done yet. I asked why, and he just said, "Need to cover the shell, in case it snows." I got up on the ladder with the tarp and started tacking it in place. That's when I heard something out past the tree line behind me. It sounded like something moving quickly through the woods. I froze, holding the tarp in one hand and the staple gun in the other. The noise wasn't clear, just a soft thumping, like footfalls on dead leaves and earth. Then it stopped. When I got down, Doug was gone. I looked around the property and found him standing near the edge of the trees, staring off into the dark pines. He didn't move when I called his name. He just stared. When I walked up beside him, he turned and walked back toward the shed without a word. That night, I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard something scraping against the back wall of the shed. Not hard, not loud, like a branch being dragged along the surface. I sat up, held my breath, and waited. The scraping stopped, and I didn't hear anything else for an hour. I finally drifted off sometime after 2. The next morning, I saw the marks. Long, shallow scratches along the back wall of the shed. Not high up, not deep, but fresh. No trees were close enough to have caused it naturally. There weren't any bushes or tools leaning back there either. Just empty air and cold dirt. I walked around the clearing, checked the cabin frame, checked the tree line. Nothing. Just still, silent woods. Doug didn't say a word about it. He just picked up a saw and started working on the roof joints. I didn't push it. We worked all day without talking much. Around 5 p.m., I told Doug I was going to hike down the hill a ways to see if I could pick up a signal and check in with my brother. He just nodded. I went about a quarter mile down the access road, climbing over rocks and trying to get a bar or two. Nothing. I turned to head back and saw someone walking through the trees off to my left. It was far enough that I couldn't see their face or make out details. They were walking slow, not toward me, but across the slope, almost like they were following something parallel to the road. They didn't look at me. They didn't stop. I crouched behind a stump and waited for them to pass. When I got back to the shed, I didn't tell Doug. He looked strung out already, and I didn't want to add to it. That night, the generator sputtered around 9 p.m. and finally quit. We had 2 flashlights and a headlamp between us. Doug lit a small fire in a shallow pit he dug near the shed, and we sat there quietly for about an hour. The night was dead still. Not even the usual creaks and snaps you get from a settling forest. Then we heard it, a single crack, like a thick branch breaking, echoing through the woods uphill from us. We both looked toward the sound. It didn't repeat. 10 minutes later, another sound. Closer this time, something like someone stepping on dry pine needles. Still no movement. Doug finally stood up and went into the shed, came out with a shotgun. I hadn't seen it before. He didn't say a word. He just sat back down and kept staring at the woods. I stayed outside until the fire burned down, then got into the shed and tried to sleep. The last night was the worst. We were supposed to leave in the morning. The cabin was nearly done, roof covered, windows framed but not glazed. Around 3 a.m., I heard the door of the shed creak. I sat up, thinking it was Doug, but he was still on his cot. The door creaked again. Then it slowly swung open by wind or something else, I don't know. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it outside. Nothing, just grass and shadow. I closed the door and bolted it. Then I heard footsteps behind the shed. Not animal footsteps. Heavy, slow, careful. I didn't move. I just sat still and listened. The steps circled the shed once, then again, and then they stopped. Doug didn't even react. He just lay there with his eyes open, looking at the ceiling. We left before dawn, packed our tools, rolled up the cots, locked the shed. Doug didn't say a thing the entire drive down the road. We hit the highway by 9 a.m., and he dropped me off at my place by late afternoon. That was the last time I saw him. 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the company. Doug had quit. No notice. Sold the property, liquidated assets. The business was being dissolved.
No explanation.
The new property owner, I learned through the supply guy, bulldozed the unfinished cabin and cleared the whole lot. I never got a solid answer about what happened up there, but I know what I felt, and I know that whatever was in those woods, it wasn't wind or animals or my imagination. Something had been watching us, circling us, waiting, and Doug, he'd known. Maybe not from day one, but he knew before I did. I never went back, never tried to find that road again. I don't camp anymore either. Even on bright days, open land makes me nervous. I stick to towns now, stick to buildings with locks and neighbors, because once you've sat in the dark and listened to someone or something circle your shelter at 3 a.m. without making a sound, you learn to stay where people are, where you're not the only warm body in a clearing miles from help. Because next time, maybe whatever it was won't just watch. My name's Evan Doyle. I was 36 when it happened, working my 10th year with the Sheriff's Department in Morgan County, Montana. I'd done everything from patrols to drug busts to interviews. I wasn't special, just another guy with a badge, trying to pay off a mortgage and survive the job. By the summer of 2014, I was hoping to move into more administrative work. Instead, I got handed something that looked like a break at first. It was anything but. The assignment came in July. I'd just come off a string of back-to-back night shifts and was operating on caffeine and stale vending machine food when the sergeant asked me to sit in on a briefing. It was a small room, just him, a guy from the U.S. Forest Service, and a rep from a federal agency that didn't bother giving a clear badge. The summary was simple. There was a cabin deep in the Highwood Mountains, up in the northern end near the old fire roads that no one uses anymore. The location wasn't marked on official maps. We weren't told who owned it. All we were told was this. For the next 7 days, I'd be stationed nearby to observe and document any activity around the cabin. I wasn't to go inside. I wasn't to make contact with anyone, no matter what I saw. Just write down what happened and check in by radio twice a day. They wanted a uniformed presence, but not interference. The phrasing was cold and specific. I was given a marked 4x4, a radio, a week's worth of food, and a long-range lens camera. No cell reception out there, just static and pine trees for 30 miles in any direction. I was told another officer would replace me on the 8th day. The next morning, I drove out before sunrise. The highway turned to gravel fast. Then gravel gave way to an old dirt road so narrow and overgrown that I scraped both mirrors trying to get through. Eventually, I reached the ridge they marked on the map. I parked in a small clearing and hiked the rest of the way up with a pack and my gear. They said my observation post would be a second, smaller cabin, more like a ranger's shack, about 500 yards from the main building I was there to watch. The shack was barely standing. Moldy roof, creaking floorboards, smelled like mice had claimed it years ago. But it had a window facing east toward the target cabin, and that was good enough. I settled in around 11 a.m. and got to work. I'll never forget what that other cabin looked like the first time I saw it through the trees. It sat alone in a shallow basin, with a wide clearing all around it. Small, boxy, gray wood that had turned almost black with age. The roof sagged a little in the middle. No visible power lines.
No antenna.
A single metal chimney sticking up like a spike. No car out front. No tire tracks. No movement. At first, I thought maybe they'd given me bad info. Maybe nobody had been there in years. But that night, I saw light. It came from a single window on the left side, faint and yellow, like from an old lantern or low-watt bulb. It stayed on for maybe 10 minutes, then disappeared. I noted the time, 2:46 a.m., and wrote it in the log, my first entry. The next day passed quietly. I stayed hidden, used the zoom lens to scan the place every hour, tried to keep alert. Nothing.
No birds.
No wind. Even the bugs felt quiet out there. I started to feel like I was buried in a pocket of silence, a place where sound didn't belong. That night, the light came back. Same window, same dim yellow. But this time, I caught something else, movement. A shape passing behind the glass. No details, just a silhouette. Someone was inside. I reached for the camera and snapped 4 quick pictures. Then I waited. The light stayed on for 20 minutes, then cut off. No one exited. Nothing else stirred. By the 4th day, my nerves were grinding down. Not from fear exactly, just the weird stillness, like the forest was waiting for something. I kept seeing that same pattern at night. One light, one figure, never leaving, never opening the door. I never saw anyone come or go. On the 5th day, I decided to walk the perimeter. I didn't get close, maybe 300 yards out, but I wanted a better angle. The clearing surrounding the cabin was perfectly smooth. No trash, no chopped wood, no tools, not even prints. Nothing to show that a human being had ever stepped outside. Then I noticed something strange about the trees around the basin. They'd been cut, not recently, but at some point long ago. All the trees immediately surrounding the cabin had been cleared in a perfect circle, but the way they were felled looked wrong. Some were cut a few feet up the trunk. Others were cracked low, like they'd been torn, not chopped, and every one of them leaned slightly away from the cabin. I stood there staring, suddenly very aware that I wasn't just in the woods. I was inside a border. That night, the light didn't come on. I waited for hours, camera ready, eyes sore from squinting, but nothing.
No glow.
No shape, no sound. I logged the silence. Around 4:20 a.m., I fell asleep sitting up, rifle across my lap. When I woke, the sun was already high, and something was different. I noticed it the second I stepped outside to relieve myself. There were footprints, not mine, bare feet, human. They started at the tree line about 20 feet from the shack and led directly to my door. Then they stopped. They didn't go around the shack, didn't retreat, just appeared like someone had walked straight out of the trees and stood there, watching, then vanished. I stepped back inside, locked the door, and kept my rifle across my chest the rest of the day. No radio contact from base. I sent my regular 10 a.m. check-in, but nobody responded. The light didn't come back that night either. I barely slept. Day 7 started slow. Same silence, same trees. No light, no movement. I counted the hours, waiting for relief. They said someone would arrive around noon. 2 p.m., I heard an engine. I nearly collapsed with relief. It took another 30 minutes for the vehicle to reach the shack. Another patrol SUV, same as mine. But it wasn't a uniformed cop who stepped out. It was a man in plain clothes, late 40s, gray beard, black ball cap with no logo. He didn't wave, didn't speak, just walked past me, opened the shack door, and started gathering my gear like it was his. I asked him where the replacement deputy was supposed to be, but he didn't answer. He just pointed back down the trail toward my truck. I didn't argue. I was exhausted and sick of being alone. I got in the SUV and drove off, leaving the man alone at the shack. When I reached the main road, I tried the radio again. Still nothing. Back at the station, no one acted like anything was unusual. They logged my notes, took the photos, then told me I was being moved to regular city patrol. No mention of the cabin, no follow-up questions. It was like the assignment had never happened. I tried asking around. Nobody else in the department knew what I was talking about. One deputy said the Highwood area was federal land and not part of our jurisdiction. Another guy told me there hadn't been any scheduled surveillance operations in the forest that month. They showed no record of my assignment. Even my own report had vanished from the system a week later. I went back to that road once about a year later. I don't even know why. Maybe just to see if the place was still there. I never found the turnoff. The road that had scraped my mirrors and bruised my arms from bouncing around. It was gone. Not overgrown. Not blocked. Just gone. Like it had never been there. I don't know who I was watching that week. I don't know what the cabin was for or who the man was who came to replace me. I don't know why there were bare footprints outside my shack. And I sure as hell don't know what happened to all the reports and photographs. But something was in that cabin. I know it. And someone wanted to make sure nobody ever asked about it again. It was October 2014 when I took the seasonal park ranger job out near the Long Ridge Preserve in northern Idaho. I was 33, single, and still trying to find a direction in life after dropping everything back in Wisconsin. I'd worked at a hardware store for nearly a decade before the layoff hit, and I didn't feel like doing another customer service job right after. I'd spent the summer hiking and camping and had gotten real familiar with the backcountry. I figured if I was going to drift for a while, I might as well get paid to be outdoors. The job wasn't anything glamorous. My assignment was at a small service cabin used mostly for wildfire watch, trail maintenance staging, and supply checks. It sat about 6 miles into the forest from the closest ranger station, where the gravel road ended and the real hiking began. They usually posted someone there only during fire season, but this year, they extended it into late fall. Apparently, some visitors had gone missing in the area earlier that year, and the office wanted eyes on the preserve through the end of the month, just in case more people decided to come up before snowfall. I was told it was probably nothing, tourists who wandered too far and didn't sign in properly, but they wanted someone up there to check for unauthorized camps, damaged signs, that sort of thing. They gave me a satellite radio, a big ring of keys, and the code to the locked steel supply hatch built into the side of the main cabin. There was a well for water, a propane tank out back, a wood stove, and a backup generator in the shed.
No plumbing, no internet, no reception.
They expected a weekly check-in by radio and a monthly report, which I would hand off when I hiked back down to resupply. Seemed simple enough. The cabin was a 16 by 20 rectangle with one small bedroom, a wood stove-heated main area, a desk, and a bunk cot. Windows on all 4 sides, though the back one was boarded up from the outside. They told me a tree branch cracked it years back and it wasn't worth replacing since that side faced nothing but dense brush. The structure itself was solid, weathered gray pine boards, steel roof, reinforced door. I remember noticing the 2 locks on the front door. One was a regular deadbolt. The other was an old but heavy sliding steel bar welded onto the inside. Didn't think much of it at the time. First week was quiet. The air had that late autumn chill, and most of the trees were half naked already. I spent my days hiking the trails, checking the signposts, clearing small limbs, picking up trash. Saw no campers, no hikers, no smoke. Sometimes a distant eagle call or the rustle of a deer. At night, I kept the stove going, wrote in the logbook, and read old ranger reports from a thick binder they kept in the desk drawer. Boring stuff, weather, maintenance logs, wildlife sightings. There was one note from back in 1996 about some unauthorized trail activity east of Burn Hollow that mentioned possibly deliberate sign tampering. But it ended with patrol issued, no follow-up. I figured maybe kids were messing with trail markers. It wasn't exactly riveting reading. Second week, things started to feel off. I was halfway through a long loop on the north end of the preserve when I saw something strange. It was a pile of stacked stones, maybe 20 or so, about 4 feet high, built right in the middle of the trail near a dry stream bed. Too neat to be natural, too tall to be the work of an animal. It wasn't balanced in a pretty way like those tourist cairns you see on mountain trails. It looked hurried, uneven, like someone had made it fast, then left. I logged it in my notepad and moved it off the trail so no one would trip. Thought maybe it was just a backpacker being weird. But the next morning, it was back. Same size, same spot. I went out again, moved it again, and looked for footprints. I found nothing. The soil there was dry and hard-packed. Not great for impressions. I left it off the trail again, further this time. Hauled the whole stack 20 feet into the brush, just to see. Next day, back again. Same stones, same spot. I don't spook easily. I've camped alone in bear country. I've slept on a tarp in freezing weather. But this gave me an itch in the base of my skull. It wasn't just the stack, it was how exact it was. Same layout, same slanted top rock, like someone was copying it each time, or putting it back the way it was. That night, I couldn't relax. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up. Around 2 a.m., I went outside with my flashlight and walked a slow circle around the clearing. Nothing, just the sound of trees shifting in the breeze and one distant owl call. The third week, I started waking up to small changes. Little things. The broom I left leaning against the door would be lying on the floor. The metal lid on the wood bin outside was ajar, even though I'd shut it tight. The nails in the firewood wall rack seemed looser than before. One day, I found my hiking boots moved from where I left them. Still inside the cabin, just a foot to the left. Not the kind of thing you'd notice unless you lived alone for a while. But it added up. The worst was the back window, the one that was boarded up. One morning, I noticed light leaking through it, thin lines between the planks. When I checked, I saw that the outer boards were still in place, but one of the nails had been pulled out. Not pried, pulled. The wood around it was splintered like it had been yanked straight through. I hammered a fresh one in hard and went back inside. I radioed in that day. Just said I was seeing signs of recent hiker activity off-trail, and maybe they should consider posting signs again near the northeast routes. I didn't say anything about the rock pile or the window. Didn't want to sound paranoid. But I started sleeping with the axe by the cot. End of that week, I found the trail cam. It wasn't one of ours. Too small. Tucked low into the brush off a side path near an old fire break. Modern, black, no logo. A motion sensor type with a small red light blinking in the corner. I only noticed it because the light caught my eye at dusk. I don't know how long it had been there. I took it back to the cabin and cracked it open. The memory card inside was full. My laptop was in the cabin, running off the inverter tied to the solar panels, so I loaded the files. There were 487 clips. Almost all of them were trees, wind, darkness, but about 40 of them were of me. Walking past, trimming branches, refilling a trail marker, even tying my boot. Different days, different times. None of which I noticed the camera. Someone had placed it well. But there was one clip that didn't show me. It was 2:14 a.m. 2 nights before. The clip showed the trail empty for about 4 seconds. Then a shape entered the frame. It was tall, human, but I couldn't make out the face. The figure stopped right in front of the camera, crouched, stared into it, then smiled. It wasn't a grin. It was wide, forced. The face didn't move otherwise, just the mouth, like a child imitating a smile without knowing what it means. Then the clip ended. I deleted it, took the memory card out, burned it in the stove along with the camera. I still had a few days left on my assignment, but I knew I wasn't staying the full 4th week. I'd hike back the next morning and radio in from the main station. Claim illness, injury, anything. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching pine needles. They circled the cabin twice. I killed the lantern and crouched near the window, axe in hand. I didn't see anything, just black shapes between blacker trees. But the sound was real. Crunch, pause, crunch, closer to the back. I stayed like that for maybe 20 minutes. Then nothing, just wind again. I waited. No more steps. I finally lay down, too tense to close my eyes. At 4:19 a.m., I heard the back door latch rattle. Not a knock, not pounding, just a test. A soft metallic tap, like someone trying to feel whether it was locked. The door didn't open, but it was the only one without a steel bar. I didn't move. I just stared at the ceiling until sunrise. I left the cabin at first light, packed only the essentials, hiked fast, didn't stop, got to the main station before noon, told the supervisor I had stomach problems, that I needed to end my post a few days early. He didn't push, just logged me out and thanked me for the work. I didn't mention the camera, or the stone pile, or the face in the video. I left Idaho the next week. Haven't worked as a ranger since. The thing that keeps me up isn't the smile or the footsteps or even the fact that someone was watching me. It's that when I was hiking back, about a mile from the cabin, I passed a tree with a mark carved into it. Clean mark, fresh. It wasn't initials or a ranger blaze. It was a smiley face, a wide, crooked smile. And under it, in small, neat cuts, was the date, October 27th, 2014. The next day, they were planning to come back, and I wasn't supposed to leave. I was 36 the summer I decided to stay in the mountains of Southern Oregon for a while. My life back in Sacramento had been dragging. I was burnt out. My construction job had become the same loop of dust, noise, and rushed deadlines. The kind of stress that hangs heavy even when you're not working. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, just the kind of friends you talk to when you're drinking, but no one you call when something's wrong. I needed a break. A buddy of mine from college, Dan, had a cousin who owned some property near Klamath Falls. It was old logging land, mostly untouched forest now. No cell service, no neighbors unless you count trees and squirrels. He told me there was a one-room cabin up there, left from the 70s, originally built for seasonal loggers. Nobody used it anymore except during hunting season. The cousin agreed to let me use it for free. Just had to bring in my own supplies and clean it when I left. It sounded perfect. I could breathe, fish a little, fix the place up for fun, be away from people. I packed tools, fishing gear, a generator, propane, canned food, a rifle, some books, and drove north. The cabin was about 12 miles from the nearest paved road. I parked my truck on a rough gravel spur and then used a four-wheeler the last couple miles through trees and muddy, rutted trails. It was late June, and the forest was thick, but not yet choked by summer heat. Just that damp smell of pine and earth. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked better than I expected. Old but standing. A low, square building with dark-stained siding, small porch, heavy door, no frills. I unlocked it with the key Dan had given me, stepped inside, and stood there taking it in. There was one cot, a workbench, a cast iron stove, a tiny sink connected to a gravity-fed tank, and a narrow window on each wall. Everything smelled like dry rot and mouse droppings, but it wasn't bad. I cleaned for 2 days straight, bleached everything, swept out the dead bugs and leaves, checked the propane line, reinforced the front door with a 2x4 and a homemade bar latch just in case. The plan was to stay for at least 3 weeks. No phone, no contact with anyone unless I drove back down the mountain. I kept a journal and marked each day. The first few days were peaceful. I fished in a nearby stream, caught a few small trout, cooked them over the stove. At night, I sat on the porch and listened to the forest hum. There was no fear, no bad feeling, just a stillness that I hadn't had in years. I slept better than I had in months. Then I started noticing things. Small things at first. On the 5th morning, I stepped outside and saw tracks in the soft dirt near the tree line. Not boot prints, not animal tracks either. They looked like bare feet. but not normal. The toes were wrong, longer or space strange. I figured it was some animal I didn't recognize. Maybe a bear with an old injury or something. That evening, I kept my rifle close while I chopped firewood. I kept looking into the trees, waiting to see movement, but there was nothing. The next morning, I found the firewood I chopped scattered around the side of the cabin, like someone had kicked through it, not just fallen over, but flung. I had to pick it all back up. Still, I told myself it was probably a raccoon or something digging through for insects. 2 nights later, I woke up around 2 a.m. and sat straight up in bed. I wasn't dreaming. Something had tapped on the window. I know the sound of branches brushing glass, and this wasn't that. It was a sharp, deliberate tap, just once, like someone had flicked their fingernail against the pane. I didn't move, just lay there, heart thudding. After a while, I got up slowly and took the rifle from beside the cot. I didn't turn on a light. I walked to the window and looked out into the darkness. But the moon was gone behind clouds and I couldn't see more than a few feet. The next morning, I walked the perimeter. I found a small handprint on the back window. Perfect little smear on the glass. Too small for a man. Not a child either. Just wrong somehow. The fingers were too narrow. I stood there staring at it for a long time. After that, I stopped going far from the cabin. I stayed close. I kept the firewood stacked higher, made noise when I moved, tried to act big. I stopped sleeping through the night. I would wake up every few hours, rifle in hand, staring at the shadows. On the 9th night, I heard breathing. Not mine. It was slow, wet, and steady, just outside the window by the cot. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I waited, body stiff, listening to the exhale. Then the inhale. Then it stopped. I heard something shift in the dirt, like someone crouching. I lay there for what felt like hours. When I finally looked, the window was dark and empty. But the next morning, I found a long scratch in the glass, like a nail, dragged across it. I told myself I needed to leave. That day I started packing, but then I stopped. I don't know why. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness. I told myself I was being paranoid. I decided to stay 2 more nights, just to prove to myself that I could. That was a mistake. The second night, something knocked on the front door. Not gently, 3 sharp bangs, like knuckles on wood. I froze. It was just after midnight. I hadn't heard anyone walk up. I hadn't heard a vehicle.
No footsteps.
Just the knock. I grabbed my rifle and walked to the door. I didn't open it. I pressed my face to the peephole I had drilled in the afternoon after the handprint. But there was nothing. Not a person. Not an animal. Just blackness. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I opened the door. The ground was undisturbed.
No prints. No marks.
No tracks. I was tired. I was angry. I decided to leave right then. I packed everything fast, left half the food, took the rifle, gassed up the 4-wheeler, and started down the trail. About a mile in, I felt something shift in the trees to my left. I turned and saw a shape move behind a trunk. Thin, upright, not a deer. I gunned the throttle and didn't stop. When I reached my truck, I loaded everything and drove 10 miles before I pulled over and puked on the side of the road. I was shaking, not from fear, but from relief. I stayed in a motel in Klamath Falls that night. When I turned on my phone, I had no messages. Nobody had even noticed I was gone. I went back once about 2 weeks later, just to see it in the daylight, just to convince myself it hadn't been that bad. I brought a friend with me, another guy from work, big guy, ex-Army. We walked around the property. Everything looked the same except one thing. On the side of the cabin, someone or something had carved a deep, narrow groove into the wood siding, about 5 feet off the ground. Not a word, not a shape, just a single line straight down, maybe a foot long. My friend said it was probably a hunter marking a spot. I nodded like I believed him, but I didn't. I never stayed in that cabin again. I didn't tell Dan or his cousin anything. Just said thanks and that I'd had a good time. Sometimes I still think about that breathing outside the window, and that handprint. Whatever it wasn't trying to kill me. It was watching, and that was worse. I was 38 when I finally took a break from my job in Manchester. I had worked 12 years straight without more than a weekend off. It wasn't some high-stakes career or anything. I managed inventory and logistics for a mid-sized food distribution company. Not exciting, but it paid the bills and kept my mind busy. Still, by the time I hit that winter in 2021, I had this dull feeling that I wasn't doing anything real with my life. It was mid-January when I booked the time off. I planned to take 3 weeks. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing with that time. Not even my sister. I just told them I was taking time off to disconnect, which wasn't a lie. I found a small plot of land online, listed by a retired farmer, up in Dumfries and Galloway in southwest Scotland. 3 acres of forest and field, bordered by an old dry stone wall and a thin river called the Clwydden Water. No house, no buildings, just space and quiet. The price was surprisingly low, but it had been on the market for over a year. I assumed it was the isolation that made people skip it. I bought it, not for good, just temporarily. The man who owned it agreed to a 3-week lease for practically nothing. I transferred the money and packed up my gear. Tent, tools, portable generator, an axe, and enough supplies to last me until February. My goal was simple. I wanted to build something with my hands. Nothing fancy, just a small cabin. 1 room, solid roof, something I could be proud of.
No cement.
No help, just wood, nails, and patience. I got there late in the evening. It was cold, but not freezing. The clouds were low and gray, and the wind pushed through the trees like it was warning me. I didn't think much of it then, just weather. I parked my van on the overgrown path that led into the property, took my things out, and pitched the tent beside a large tree. It was the only one that didn't creak in the wind. The first few days were good. I cleared out the brush where I planned to set the foundation. The air smelled of wet pine and moss. The days were short, but I worked while the light lasted, then sat by a small fire reading until the cold made my fingers numb. There was no signal out there, no phone, no contact. It was what I wanted. On the 4th night, something changed. I had just finished eating a tin of baked beans when I noticed something strange in the trees across from my tent. About 20 feet off, standing dead still, was a shape. At first I thought it was just a tree stump or maybe a bit of hanging tarp I'd left out. But the longer I looked, the more certain I became that it wasn't there the night before. It had shoulders, a head. I stood up, not scared yet, just uneasy. I stepped closer, but the angle of the branches made it hard to see. When I got about 10 feet from it, I realized it was gone. I walked around for 20 minutes with a flashlight, thinking maybe I had imagined it, or maybe it was an animal. There were deer in the area, and sometimes their silhouettes could look human in the dark. That night, I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I got back to work. I didn't let the memory of the figure bother me. I told myself the isolation was getting to my head. I cut the first planks for the cabin walls and built a basic frame. Felt good to work. My arms hurt, my back hurt, but in the right kind of way. I could see the shape of the structure taking form. It was real. It was mine. But that night, again, I noticed something. This time, it wasn't a figure. It was a sound. Someone walking. It was subtle at first. Just the crunch of dry twigs somewhere in the woods. But it was deliberate. Not wind. Not an animal. The steps stopped when I moved. When I got up and looked out with my flashlight, There was nothing, but the air felt tight, like something was watching. The next morning, I found boot prints behind my tent. Not mine. They were slightly wider and deeper, and they came from the trees but didn't go back in. Like someone had stood there, watching me sleep. I told myself I was being paranoid. I looked around for cameras, wires, any sign someone was messing with me. But there was nothing. No tire tracks.
No trash.
Just the prints. I moved my tent closer to the structure. I stayed awake that night, sitting inside the cabin frame with a hammer in my hand and a flashlight resting on a piece of wood. The wind was sharp. My eyes burned, but I didn't hear anything. For 2 nights, it stayed quiet. I kept building. I cut and nailed the roof beams in place. I made a temporary front door from scrap plywood. I hung up an old jacket in the corner to make it feel like a real place. It started to look like something a person could live in. But then something happened that I couldn't explain away. I woke up around 3 a.m. on the 10th night to the sound of something heavy being dropped right outside the cabin wall. Not like a tree falling, closer, sharp, intentional. I scrambled up and pulled open the plywood door. My flashlight caught movement just at the tree line, a shape moving behind a thick trunk. Again, it had the size and outline of a man, but it was silent. Even when it moved, it made no sound. I yelled into the dark. Nothing. I walked in the direction of the tree line, swinging the beam of my light around like a weapon. No movement.
No breath.
I stayed out there for over an hour. I found nothing, but when I came back to the cabin, I found something leaned up against the wall. A rock. Not just a random rock, but a flat one, about the size of my hand, and it had something carved into it. 3 vertical lines and a circle underneath. It was crudely scratched, but it was intentional. I took it and threw it into the woods. I told myself it was just some hiker playing a joke. But that was a lie. No one knew I was out there. No one knew where I had gone. I hadn't told anyone the location. Not even my sister. That morning, I packed up the tent and moved my sleeping bag inside the cabin. I locked the makeshift door from the inside with a board. I didn't care if it was overkill. I didn't care if it made me look crazy. I just needed 1 more week to finish. But the next few days were worse. The noises came every night. Footsteps around the cabin, sometimes circling, sometimes stopping just outside the wall. I tried to ignore them. I kept working. I told myself if I could just finish the roof and seal the walls, I'd be safe inside. On the 12th day, I found something else. A pile of bones near the edge of the property. Not buried, just laid out in a neat circle. Rabbit bones, I think. They were clean. Too clean. No meat, no blood. Just arranged like someone had taken their time with them. I didn't touch them. I just walked back to the cabin and stayed inside the rest of the day. The next night was the worst. It was cold. Wind was scraping against the wood. I had the generator running low to save fuel, just enough to keep the lantern on. I stayed wrapped in my sleeping bag, watching the door. I didn't hear footsteps this time. I heard breathing, right outside the wall. It wasn't heavy, just steady, like someone standing still, nose against the wood. I didn't move. I didn't blink. It went on for what felt like hours. Then slowly it faded. When the sun came up, I stepped outside. I found a handprint on the wall. Not in mud, in blood. It was smeared along the grain, long fingers dragged downward. I stood there for a long time. My legs felt hollow. My chest was tight. I packed everything up that day. I didn't wait for the lease to end. I didn't finish the roof. I drove back to Manchester and didn't stop once. Not for food, not for fuel. I barely slept for the next few weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure. I heard the breathing. I saw the handprint. A month later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photograph of the cabin, the one I had built. The photo was taken at night. from outside, from the trees, and in the window, just barely visible, was the shadow of a man standing inside. But I had already left.